Let's talk to Marc Almond, who is, of course, director of the Crisis Research Institute, because a lot of people now are not content with being worried about what's happening in Ukraine and Gaza and the Middle East, but also in Iran. Now, we've got to worry about a conflict in Kashmir, which involves, of course, two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan. Mark's got a piece of The Sun this morning. India and Pakistan locked in perilous military tit-for-tat, and this really could mean nuclear war. Mark, a very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. It is quite alarming, this. It's been a sort of a simmering sore, I suppose, if you want, for hundreds of years, I guess, and most recently for certainly the last century or so. What's different about it this time, do you think?
Well, I think it is the fact that two countries equipped with nuclear weapons are shooting at each other. There have been dogfights in the air, there's artillery bombardment over the dividing line.
Yeah.
And if you think back, say, to the classic Cold War crises between Washington and Moscow, say the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Americans and the Russians were not shooting at each other. Right. Yes, it was enormously tense and dangerous, but we've now gone slightly beyond the safety zone, where we have a test in real time as to whether nuclear deterrence works to stop countries with the bomb going to war with each other, or whether, if they're already fighting each other, they will escalate to pass to the ultimate war act, which is, of course, a mass destruction weapon.
Yes. And, I mean, what would be the terms or the conditions under which something like that would happen? I mean, I was listening to a discussion about this yesterday on Times Radio, actually, and people were saying, well, the trouble is that, you know, the Brits can say what they want. We don't really have much influence in that region in particular. China,
but we're blamed by both sides for creating the conditions with partition of India in 1947.
Well, I mean, everything's our fault, isn't it? I mean, no doubt.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying it is our fault.
No.
But if you're a Pakistani or an Indian, we're a useful scapegoat.
Yes, no, I'm sure. But, I mean, whether or not they pay any attention to what David Lammy has to say is my point. They really don't. Yeah. And they don't really pay much attention to the United Nations either. They might listen to China, however.
Well, Pakistan certainly looks to China as a friend and ally and a provider of many of the modern weapons that it's been using in the last 48 hours. Yeah. The problem is India has a serious border dispute with China, as well as the problem of Kashmir with Pakistan. Yeah. So the chances of China being drawn into a big conflict between India and Pakistan are quite serious. And then you'd move from a war between two Commonwealth countries to a war between the two biggest countries in the world in terms of population. Right. And so that would be horrific.
Yeah. And I mean, what significance is there to the fact that, I mean, I call him the most unlucky Prime Minister that we've ever had, Keir Starmer. I mean, literally on the day that he announces this big trade deal with India, you know, suddenly they decide to launch a few warplanes on their nearest neighbour.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid, you know, Keir Starmer does not pass Napoleon's test for promotion. Is he lucky?
He's not. He's really not, is he?
Yeah. No. I mean, again, it's a crisis which ultimately Britain might want to interpose itself, the Foreign Office might want to mediate, but ultimately either China or the United States are the two potential big powers who can knock heads together. But as I say, China has a lot of interest in backing Pakistan. Donald Trump has said he'd like to mediate, but he's also been very friendly to Prime Minister Modi of India. Right. And there are all sorts of good reasons for America and India to get together, the two biggest, as it were, democracies in the world and so on. Yeah. But it does make it very difficult to find a genuine, honest broker.
Yes. And the Trump right, of course, is quite keen on Hindu nationalism, isn't it? Which I presume doesn't exactly please the Pakistanis on the other side.
Yeah, and I think we have to say that we can think in Britain the protests about Gaza, pro-Palestinian protests, were primarily by British people of Pakistani origin. Yeah. And many of them see Kashmir as the Gaza of Central Asia, as it were. Right. And at the same time, many Hindu nationalists see Israel as a model for how to deal with Muslim fundamentalist terrorist groups. Right. So you have these very deep, entrenched positions, and it's very difficult to find any common ground between them. Right.
And we've seen previously, and I know this is a slightly smaller kind of microcosm of the whole thing, but we've seen disputes, haven't we, turn into quite violent outbursts in places like Leicester in this country and other parts of sort of what you might call Britain's cities, which are occupied by some of these countrymen, basically. And that's obviously another worry that we have to deal with.
Yeah. I remember in 1990, Roy Hattersley asked me, he said, what's the biggest item in my mailbag every week for my Birmingham Sparkbrook constituency? Yeah. And I floundered around. He said, no, Kashmir. Kashmir was what really got the letter writers from Birmingham getting onto him.
Yeah.
And we have to say, mercifully, for 35 years, people's anger and involvement was primarily writing in green ink on yellow lined paper.
Right.
Now the danger might be that this past form, where people have let off steam and then gone home, might now actually spiral out of control.
Yeah.
It's one thing for people to go down to the Indian High Commission or the Pakistani High Commission to protest what they don't like about those governments. But if people actually in Birmingham, in Leicester, as you say, and so on, begin to say, let's go to the streets,
yeah,
because our side in this conflict is being neglected or abused in some way, that's much more dangerous.
Yeah. And I think that is a problem, isn't it? So, I mean, what's likely to happen over the next, few days and weeks?
Yeah.
I mean, are we looking at the start of something that's going to go on for a while?
Well, it has gone on really since 1947 in one sense. So the problem is, even if we can calm this particular crisis, we can't draw the sting of what really causes this very bitter dispute.
Yeah.
For Indians, for Hindus, Kashmir is a centre of their ancient historical religious sites and so on. For Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, at any rate, overwhelmingly, it is a place where they say, if we had democracy, we would have voted. The Muslims in Kashmir, who are the majority, would have voted to join Pakistan. They're being denied their rights, and so it's very difficult to find a moderate solution between them.
And there's no way really to sort of divide Kashmir up, is there? Because I'm told that the Pakistanis like the idea that it's got a border with China. Obviously, India like the fact that it keeps part of, I suppose, northern India very much part of what they can claim to be their own. And historically, it really doesn't belong to anyone, does it?
Well, obviously, for instance, the history of India and Pakistan, for that matter, is they are creations of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And the British Empire overthrew the Mughal Empire. And so the attempt to write back into history the idea that somewhere was always part of India or Pakistan when they're essentially modern states was part of this propaganda war, if you like. There are all sorts of terrible things. By the way, we're worried about the hydrogen bomb going off, but what about the water bomb, the H2O bomb? Because India controls the waters of the main rivers, which provide all the water that Pakistan gets for its agriculture and for people to drink. But China controls the headwaters of the rivers that go to India.
Yeah.
So we could see a war over water as much as a war with weapons, or war using water as well.
Yeah, and that could be just as catastrophic, I suppose. And what about Nepal? Where does that sit in all of this? Because that's kind of off to the side of India, between India and China as well. Yeah.
Well, in many ways, Nepal, like, say, Bangladesh, has an ambivalent relationship with India, and for that matter, to some extent with China. But China is less, shall we say, of a threat to Nepal because the Himalayas shield it from the enormous power of China in Tibet, neighbouring Tibet and so on. But on the other hand, the government of Nepal doesn't really want to risk being gradually absorbed into the economic and other dominant spaces of India. Remember, India is a big growing economy. Why Keir Starmer, and for that matter the Tories, wanted to make this trade deal with India is the belief that, like China, the 21st century is going to belong economically to India and China, and we ought to get in on the ground floor.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. Let's hope it doesn't turn into anything more than fascinating. But we shall see. Marc, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Marc Almond, writing in The Sun today, Director of the Crisis Research Institute in Oxford.